"You don't belong in this room, son. You don't belong near this table, and you sure as hell don't belong anywhere near my daughter. So finish your little plate. Take whatever dignity you think you walked in here with, and leave before I have someone help you find the door." Catherine Beaumont said it with a smile. That was the part Jalen Morrow would remember for years afterward. Not the words themselves, which were cruel enough, but the smile she wore while saying them, bright and social, the kind of smile a woman uses when she's passing hors d'oeuvre or greeting a neighbor at church. She smiled at him the way she would smile at a stain on the tablecloth. Something unfortunate that needed removing before the real guests noticed. Then she picked up her glass of Sancerre and poured it across the linen in front of him, slowly, almost lovingly, the pale gold spreading across the white cloth like a bruise forming in real time. The dining room went quiet. 30 guests, old Savannah money, all of them watching. Not one of them moved. 4 years later, Jalen Morrow came back and bought everything she had. Every property, every note, every brick. And the smile she had worn that night was a thing he never saw again. Savannah in October still carried the heat of summer in its bones, the air thick and sweet with whatever the live oaks were breathing out, and the light falling through the Spanish moss, the way it does in paintings that tourists buy on River Street and hang in living rooms 1,000 miles from here. Jalen came back on a Thursday. He drove himself a rented truck with a landscaping company's name on the side, and he parked it 3 blocks from the Beaumont estate on Abercorn Street, and walked the rest of the way with a pair of work gloves folded into his back pocket. Nobody recognized him. That was by design. 4 years changes a man's body and his bearing, and Jalen had changed both deliberately. He was broader now, heavier in the shoulders, and he moved with a patience he had not owned at 21. The patience of a man who has learned that the fastest way to get somewhere is to look like you're not going anywhere at all. The Beaumont family owned 3 properties in the historic district and 1 outside the city. The estate on Abercorn, a riverside inn called the Winfield that had been in the family since Reconstruction, a crumbling event venue on Drayton Street, and a commercial lot near Tybee that nobody in the family could agree on selling. Together, they formed what Catherine still called an empire, though the word had grown generous. The Winfield was the only one that made real money anymore. The estate ate cash. The event venue had been bleeding for 2 years, and the Tybee lot sat there like a tooth the family kept touching with its tongue, sore and unresolved. Jalen knew all of this. He had spent 4 years making sure he knew all of it. He got hired onto the grounds crew at the Winfield by the 2nd week. The property manager, a tired man named Gil Prather, barely glanced at his paperwork. Jalen had made the paperwork say exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. A clean work history, a horticultural certificate from a community college in Jacksonville, references that rang to numbers answered by people whose salaries he paid. By Monday, he was trimming boxwood hedges along the garden walk. By Tuesday, he had mapped every crack in the property's foundation, literal and financial, and had started counting. He saw Lorraine Beaumont for the first time on a Wednesday morning. She came through the garden with a clipboard and a phone pressed between her shoulder and ear, arguing with someone about a linen supplier who had shorted them 40 tablecloths for a wedding that weekend. She looked like her mother in the way a river looks like the spring it came from. The same architecture, the same bones, but she carried it differently. Where Catherine wore her presence like armor, Lorraine wore hers like something she was still deciding whether to keep. She was 26 now, event coordinator for the Winfield, a title Catherine had given her the way a person gives a dog a sweater. More for appearance than function. Lorraine planned the weddings and the galas and the charity luncheons, and Catherine approved or overruled every decision from behind a desk she visited twice a week, always unannounced, always with notes. Lorraine didn't see Jalen immediately. He was kneeling near the azaleas with a pair of shears, hat low, and she walked past him close enough that he smelled the perfume she still wore, the same one, jasmine and something underneath it, that he had never been able to name, and the 4 years folded shut inside his chest like a door slamming. Then she turned. The phone slipped. She caught it, but her eyes stayed on him, and he watched the recognition move across her face the way weather moves across a field. Fast, total, impossible to pretend you hadn't seen. Jalen? It's Beaumont, he said. He said it the way any grounds worker says a client's name, flat and polite, and he saw the formality land on her like cold water. She came closer. She looked at his hands, the work gloves, the shears, the dirt on his knees. She was doing the math. The last time she had seen him, he had been a senior at SCAD with a portfolio of architectural drawings and a plan to change the world, and her mother had poured wine across a tablecloth and told him he wasn't worth the linen it stained. "What are you doing here?" she said quietly. "Working. Here. Of all the places in the world, you're working here. Somebody has to keep the hedges straight." She didn't laugh. He hadn't expected her to. The old Lorraine would have laughed, would have grabbed his arm and pulled him somewhere private, and demanded the full story with the kind of breathless urgency that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. This one stood very still and measured him with eyes that had learned to measure people the way her mother did, carefully, before deciding how much of herself to spend. "I thought you went to Atlanta," she said. "I did, and you came back to trim hedges. I came back." He let her filth in the rest however she wanted. A man called her name from inside the inn, the catering manager, needing a signature, and the moment closed. She looked at him once more, and the question in her eyes was the same question that had been there 4 years ago when her mother had thrown the wine. "Why aren't you fighting back?" She didn't ask it. She went inside. Jalen went back to the azaleas. His hands were steady. His chest was not. That night, he drove the rented truck to a house on the south side that was not the small apartment he pretended to live in. The house was modest from the outside and unremarkable in every way that mattered, which was the point. Inside, he sat at a desk that held 2 laptops, a stack of legal folders, and a phone that was not the prepaid one he carried at the Winfield. He called Sandra Okafor. Sandra had been with him since the patent. She had been a second-year associate at a mid-size firm in Atlanta when Jalen walked in with a logistics algorithm he'd written on a borrowed laptop in a friend's garage. An optimization model for last-mile delivery routing that did in seconds what most companies were spending millions to do badly. She had looked at the code, then looked at him and said, "You need a patent attorney, not a corporate one, but I know a guy, and you should not leave this building until we've called him." The patent had licensed. Then it had licensed again. Then a major carrier had come to the table, and then a second, and then the numbers stopped being numbers and started being architecture. The kind of money that builds things, that acquires things, that sits quietly in rooms and changes the temperature without anyone noticing it entered. Sandra had been there for all of it. She had been there when Jalen formed the fund, a private vehicle with a name that meant nothing to anyone, and appeared in no headline. She had been there when he began, slowly and invisibly, buying the distressed debt of a family in Savannah, Georgia, that had been living beyond its foundations for 20 years, and was too proud to notice the cracks. "The last tranche closed yesterday," Sandra told him on the phone. "You're at 44% of the voting interest. With the debt conversion, you'll clear 48 by the end of the month. Keep the fund's name out of it. It's always out of it." She paused. "Jalen, you're 2 moves from owning this family. Are you sure you know what the last move is?" He was sure. He had been sure for 4 years. He had built the plan the way he built everything, meticulously, invisibly, with a patience that most people mistook for absence. He would let the Beaumonts collapse under the weight of their own mismanagement. He would be there holding the deed when they hit the ground. And Catherine Beaumont would look up from the wreckage and see the face of the boy she had poured wine in front of and called nothing, and she would understand, finally and too late, what nothing could become. That was the plan. Clean, cold, complete. Then he found the invoices. It happened during his 3rd week on the grounds crew. He had been in the maintenance shed pulling irrigation records. A plausible reason to be near the filing cabinets. And the irrigation files were next to the vendor files. And the vendor files were a disaster. Not the kind of disaster that comes from carelessness. The kind that comes from someone being very careful about hiding something. Philip Beaumont, Catherine's younger brother, handled the finances for all 4 Beaumont properties. He had the title of CFO, which in a family company meant he was the person Catherine trusted to keep the books clean while she kept the rooms full. Jalen had expected incompetence. What he found was theft. Philip had been skimming for at least 18 months. Phantom vendors, inflated repair invoices, maintenance contracts with companies that existed only as P.O. boxes and bank accounts. The amounts were small enough individually that no single line item would raise a flag. But together they formed a river running steadily out of the family's accounts and into Philip's. Jalen sat in the maintenance shed, with the folders spread across a workbench, and understood 3 things at once. First, that Philip's embezzlement was accelerating the collapse he had come to profit from. Second, that he could do absolutely nothing, and the family would fall faster than he had projected. Third, that when it fell, it would not land on Catherine. Catherine would find a wall to put between herself and the impact. She always had. It was her single genuine talent. It would land on Lorraine. Lorraine, whose name was on the operational paperwork. Lorraine, who signed the checks Philip told her to sign without showing her what was underneath them. Lorraine, who would be the one standing in front of a bankruptcy court trying to explain expenses she had never approved and never seen. For 3 days, Jalen told himself it didn't matter. Lorraine was a Beaumont. The Beaumonts had thrown him out. Whatever happened to them was the natural consequence of their own rot, and he owed them nothing. Least of all the woman who had stood in her mother's dining room 4 years ago and let it happen without saying a word. On the 4th day, he wrote the report. He did it on one of the laptops in the house on the south side, laying out every discrepancy in clean columns. Vendor names, invoice numbers, payment dates, the gap between what was billed and what was done. He cross-referenced the phantom vendors against state registrations and found 3 that had no physical address and 2 that shared a bank routing number with an account in Philip's wife's maiden name. The document was 12 pages long and airtight. A forensic accountant would have taken a month. Jalen finished it before midnight, because numbers had always spoken to him the way color speaks to a painter, fluently and without effort. He left the report on Lorraine's desk in the small office behind the front desk of the Winfield. No signature. 1 handwritten line at the top, "Start with Magnolia Millworks." He knew she would recognize his handwriting. He had once drawn the floor plan of the house they'd talked about building together on a napkin at a café on Broughton Street, and she had kept the napkin. He did not know if she still had it. But handwriting is a fingerprint, and he was not trying to hide. She found it the next morning. He was edging the walkway near the east garden when he saw her through the office window. She picked up the pages. She went still. She read the line at the top twice, then looked up and scanned the grounds, and he stepped behind the crepe myrtle before her eyes found him. She didn't come to him. The old Lorraine would have. This one did something that made him, against every cold intention he had carried for 4 years, proud of her. She said nothing. For 5 days she came in early and stayed late. She pulled her own copies of the vendor contracts. She called the listed phone numbers and found disconnected lines. She drove to 2 of the addresses and found empty lots. She rebuilt the case from scratch, not on his evidence but on her own, brick by brick, so that when she moved it would be her foundation she was standing on. He had handed her a thread. She wove a rope. On the 6th day, she called a meeting with Philip and the property manager in the small conference room at the Winfield. Jalen was not invited. He was a landscaper. But the windows were open to the October air, and he positioned himself near enough to hear. "I'm suspending the current vendor contracts for all 4 properties," Lorraine said. "Effective today." Philip's voice climbed immediately. "You can't do that. Catherine approved those contracts. Catherine approved what you showed her. I'm looking at what you didn't show her. Every vendor reapplies. Every invoice gets a second review. If the work is real, nobody has a problem. You're going to call your mother and explain this. If she wants an explanation, I'll show her why Magnolia Millworks billed us $62,000 for woodwork on a building that hasn't had a carpenter in it since March." The room went quiet. Through the window, Jalen watched Philip's face lose its color the way a beach loses water before a wave. Lorraine had stepped off the ledge, and she had done it alone. He should have felt the gears of his plan turning. The crack he had come to exploit was widening, and Lorraine's own hand was the one doing it. Instead, he felt something he had not accounted for in 4 years of meticulous planning. He felt the old pull, the one he had told himself he'd severed, tightened between them like a wire humming in the dark. Catherine Beaumont learned about the suspended contracts the same evening, and she did what Catherine always did. She identified not the problem but the threat. The problem was Philip, and problems could be managed. The threat was whoever had put steel in her daughter's spine, because Lorraine had never had that spine on her own. Catherine made calls. She had people look into the grounds crew, into the new hire from Jacksonville, into the quiet man who kept his hat low and his hands busy, and had arrived at the Winfield 2 weeks before her daughter suddenly developed opinions. What came back was nothing, a clean history, references that checked, a man without a story, and a man without a story, in Catherine's experience, was the most expensive kind there was. She did not connect him to the boy from the dinner party. 4 years had changed his body and his bearing, and Catherine had spent those 4 years not thinking about Jalen Morrow. Because to think about him would be to examine the night she had poured the wine, and to examine that night would be to touch something she had sealed shut a long time ago. What Catherine had sealed shut was this. When she was 29, a man named Otis Langford had come into her father's life. Otis was charming and poor and brilliant with numbers, and he had talked his way into managing the family's accounts with a smile that made people believe things they should have verified. By the time the Beaumonts understood what Otis had done, he was gone, and a third of the family's wealth had gone with him. Catherine had spent the next 15 years rebuilding. She had married well and managed ruthlessly, and she had extracted a single lesson from the wreckage and driven it so deep into her bones that it had become indistinguishable from instinct. A person with nothing and a gift for making you trust them is the most dangerous thing that can walk through your door. The only safe person is one who already has what you have, because they have no reason to take it. She told herself this was about character, not color. She told herself that with conviction, the way a person tells themselves anything they need to believe in order to keep standing. But fear has a way of fusing with the nearest visible difference. And somewhere across the years, the hunger she feared and the face she feared it in had welded together until she could no longer feel the seam. So when she had looked at Jalen 4 years ago, gifted, penniless, looking at her daughter with the same focus Otis Langford had once turned on her father's ledgers, she had not seen a young man in love. She had seen a future she had already survived once and would not survive again. The wine on the tablecloth was not cruelty to her. It was a mother pulling her child back from an open window. That she might have been wrong was a door she had bricked shut. She bricked it tighter now. If she could not remove the man from her daughter's orbit, she would remove her daughter's freedom to choose him. She announced at a family dinner the following week, without consulting Lorraine, without consulting anyone, that she had been in discussions with the Hargrove family. Old money, impeccable name. A son called Bennett who was handsome in a forgettable way, and safe in every way that Catherine measured safety. A marriage between Lorraine and Bennett Hargrove would stabilize the Beaumont finances, restore the family's standing in the circles that mattered, and end whatever romantic delusion had turned her daughter into a woman who voided contracts. "This isn't a request," Catherine said, setting down her fork the way a judge sets down a gavel. "The Hargroves are expecting an answer by the end of the month." "An answer to a question nobody asked me," Lorraine said. "Everyone is a negotiation, sweetheart. The only question is whether you set your own terms or someone sets worse ones for you. I'm not a transaction. Then stop acting like one and start acting like someone who understands what this family needs to survive." Lorraine left the table. She left the house. She drove through Savannah's dark squares with no destination, the live oaks overhead making tunnels of the streetlight, and her hands brought her to the only address in the city that had ever felt like the opposite of her mother's dining room. Jalen opened the door before she knocked. He had heard the car. He stood in the doorframe in a plain t-shirt, no work gloves now, no hat, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across 4 years of silence. "She's marrying me off," Lorraine said. Her voice was steady, and the steadiness was its own kind of fracture. Bennett Hargrove. She decided at dinner. "Like ordering from a menu. Come inside," Jalen said. She did. The house was spare. A desk, 2 chairs, nothing on the walls. She didn't notice, because she was past noticing anything but what she had driven across the city to say. 4 years ago, I let her win. I stood in that dining room and I watched her pour wine on the table in front of you and I didn't say a word. I was 22. I had nothing that was mine. Her name was on everything, even the air I breathed, and I have hated myself for it every single day since." She looked at him. "I am not doing it again, whatever it costs. I'm not letting her decide who I am one more time." Jalen looked at her and the careful architecture of distance he had maintained since the garden. The flat voice, the formal name, the hat pulled low, collapsed in his hands like wet paper. "I never blamed you for that night," he said. "You were a kid living in her house. I blamed her. I have blamed her every day for 4 years." He stopped, because the next sentence was the truth, and he had not intended to let it out. "I came back to make her pay for it." "I know," Lorraine said. "I've known since I saw your handwriting." "And that doesn't scare you?" "What scares me is that you came all the way back here to burn her down and you didn't tell me you were here. You were going to do all of it without me." "I didn't come back for you," he said, plainly, because she deserved plainness. "I came back for her. You were the part I never planned for." She reached up and put her hand against his face, the way a person touches something to make sure it's real. "Then plan for me now," she said. What followed was not the collision of strangers. It was the quiet devastation of 2 people who had spent 4 years learning to live without each other and discovering, all at once, that they had never actually managed it. The hurt didn't vanish. It simply stopped being a wall. They held on to each other in the sparse room as if the floor of the whole city had tilted, and for a long time neither of them needed words for what was being said. Later, in the dark, Jalen nearly told her everything. The fund, the debt, the 48% he had built like a cage around her family without her knowing. The words sat at the front of his mouth and he could feel their weight, but he felt, too, the shape of how it would sound, that he had engineered everything, that even this, even her hand on his face, could be folded into the long machinery of his revenge. The truth had changed its nature without his permission. For 4 years it had been a weapon, the blade he was keeping hidden until the moment it would do the most damage. Now, lying next to her, it had become something else. Something that could wound her. And a weapon you cannot use without hurting the person you are trying to protect is no longer a weapon. It is only a secret, and secrets, Jalen was learning, are heavier than blades. He said nothing. He told himself there would be a better time. There is almost never a better time, but men in love have always believed otherwise. 2 weeks later, the Beaumont Heritage Gala arrived. An annual performance of wealth, staged at a rented ballroom on Broughton Street, because none of the family's own properties were in good enough shape to host it. A fact everyone knew and nobody mentioned. Catherine used the event the way she used everything, as proof. Proof that the family still stood. Proof that the name still meant something. Proof that the cracks were someone else's problem. Lorraine came because absence would have been a declaration she wasn't ready to make. Jalen came because Lorraine asked him, and because he had stopped pretending, at least to himself, that he was only a landscaper. Catherine found him near the edge of the room, away from the music. She had an envelope in her hand. Inside it was a check, written that afternoon, a number large enough to change an ordinary man's life and small enough to mean nothing to her. "I'll be direct," she said, "since you seem to prefer it. I don't know who you work for, and frankly, I've stopped caring. This is more than they're paying you. Take it, disappear from my daughter's life, and we never speak again." She held out the envelope. "Men like, you always have a price. I'm asking you yours." 4 years ago, words like that had cracked something inside him and sent him through a door he thought he'd never walk back through. He had replayed the moment 10,000 times, and in every version he had said something devastating, something that cut her the way she had cut him. He said none of it now. He looked at the check. Then he looked at Catherine, really looked at her, at the fear she had dressed in pearls and called dignity, at the woman holding a piece of paper as if money were a wall that could keep the world the shape she needed it to be. "There's no price, Mrs. Beaumont," he said quietly. "There was never going to be one." He did not take the check. He did not raise his voice. "You should hold on to that. You're going to need every dollar you have before long." He walked away into the light and the music, and left her standing at the edge of her own party, with her hands still extended and a cold she could not name moving through her. She didn't sleep that night. She made calls, and by morning Catherine had done the only thing a frightened person with power knows how to do. She moved first. She assembled votes on the family board. She called in favors decades old. By 9 a.m., she had enough support to remove Lorraine from all operational authority, void every change Lorraine had made to the vendor contracts, and sell the family's controlling interest in the distressed properties to an outside buyer before whatever predator was circling could close its teeth. She would burn the house down herself before she let someone else take it. Jalen got the call at 6 in the morning. Sandra Okafor's voice was flat and fast. Catherine had the votes. The meeting was at 10. By 11, Lorraine would be out. The controlling interest would be sold to the first bidder, and 4 years of invisible work would be worth nothing. Because the one thing Jalen had never been able to acquire was time, and Catherine had just stolen the last of it. There was only one way to stop it. He had spent 4 years making sure no one in Savannah knew his name. To save Lorraine, he would have to walk into that boardroom and tell every person in it exactly who he was, and accept that Lorraine, watching him reveal a fortune he had hidden from her through every honest moment they had shared, might never believe any of it had been real. He sat in the dark house with the phone in his hand and understood that the secret had come due, and there was no version of paying it that didn't cost him everything. "Tell them I'm coming," he said. The Beaumont family board met in a conference room on the 3rd floor of an attorney's office on Bull Street. Catherine took the chair at the head of the table the way she took every chair, as if it had been built specifically to hold her. The faces around the table belonged to people whose families had been tangled with hers for generations, people who owed her, or feared her, or simply preferred the world in which she remained the person to be owed and feared. Philip sat to her right, pale and performatively composed. Lorraine sat halfway down the table with a single folder in front of her and no allies visible in the room. Catherine read the resolution aloud. Removal of Lorraine Beaumont from all operational roles, effective immediately, on grounds of unauthorized contract terminations and mismanagement of vendor relationships. She dressed the knife in the language of governance. It was cleaner that way. "This isn't punishment," Catherine said, looking at her daughter with an expression that almost passed for tenderness. "It's protection. Someday you'll understand the difference." Lorraine opened her folder. "Before the board votes," she said, "they should see what they're voting on." She slid copies down the table, the vendor contracts, the invoices, the permits, the gap between what was billed and what existed. "I'd like someone to explain how we paid $62,000 to a millwork company with no address, no employees, and no record of ever milling anything. I suspended those contracts because they were fraudulent. If that's the mismanagement I'm being removed for, I'd like the minutes to reflect what I was managing." The room shifted. Philip's jaw went tight. 2 board members were already turning pages with the careful attention of people who sense they have been standing near something they should have examined sooner. Catherine felt the morning's certainty slip half an inch beneath her. Her daughter had done the one thing she had not anticipated. She had refused to fall quietly, and she had brought proof. "These are serious claims," said a board member named Ashworth, a gray-haired man who had known the family for 30 years. "Catherine, were you aware of any of this?" "My daughter is deflecting from the question," Ashworth said slowly. "Just changed." The room had not become a victory. Lorraine knew that. She didn't have the votes. She had only made the votes uncomfortable, turned a foregone conclusion into an open question. but she had done it on her own ground, with her own evidence. And no one in that room could ever say again that Lorraine Beaumont had simply been carried. That was when the door opened. Jalen walked in, and for a moment no one understood what they were seeing, because the man who came through the door did not match any version of him that belonged in this building. He was not in work clothes. He wore a suit that had been cut for him by someone who cuts suits for very few people. Dark, quiet, unmistakable. The kind of tailoring that does not announce money because it has never needed to. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who had been in 1,000 rooms like this, and the ease was the thing that unsettled them before they understood anything else. Catherine recovered first. Contempt was the fastest thing she owned. "This is a closed meeting. I don't know how you got past the front desk, but you can wait downstairs with Mrs. Beaumont." The voice that cut her off was not Jalen's. It belonged to the woman who had entered behind him, precise and unhurried in a charcoal suit, carrying a leather portfolio that she set on the table with a small final sound. "My name is Sandra Okafor. I represent the controlling interest holder of the entities that currently hold the Beaumont family's outstanding debt obligations. My client requested that I be present before any vote is taken. I'd recommend the board hear what I have to say." She opened the portfolio. She did not rush. She laid out the acquisition records, the assignment of notes, the 4-year history of a single private fund purchasing the Beaumont family's distressed debt one position at a time. Never conspicuously, never traceably, until the debt was no longer owed to a dozen scattered creditors but to one. Then she laid out the final document, the one that made Ashworth sit back in his chair. The one that made Philip press his palms flat against the table as if the surface were the only solid thing left in the room. "As of yesterday's close," Sandra said, "my client holds 48.1% of the voting interest in this company. That is the single largest position at this table. It exceeds the family block Mrs. Beaumont assembled, which I'll note reaches approximately 29%. Any resolution this board passes today requires my client's support to carry." The silence was absolute. Catherine's eyes moved from the attorney to the man in the dark suit beside her, and the arithmetic she had trusted for 40 years failed her all at once because there was only one conclusion, and it was the one her entire life had told her was impossible. "Who?" Catherine said, and her voice was no longer even, "is your client?" "You've met him," Sandra said, 4 years ago, at your dinner table." Jalen stepped forward. He did not smile. "You looked into me," he said. "You found a fund buying Savannah debt and a landscaper standing near it, and you decided I was the errand boy. You couldn't make the other answer fit, because the other answer meant the man you poured wine in front of and called nothing had walked back into your house owning the floor." He let it sit. "Nobody sent me, Mrs. Beaumont. I built it myself, every dollar. Starting the week after you told me I didn't belong at your table." He turned to the board and his voice shifted into the register of a man conducting business, because that was what this had become. 2 items. First, the resolution removing Lorraine Beaumont from operational authority is withdrawn. The record should reflect that her actions identified ongoing financial fraud that this board's leadership declined to investigate. He looked at Catherine. "Second, I'm exercising my voting interest to remove Catherine Beaumont as chair of this board, effective immediately." It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was 4 sentences in a quiet room, and it ended 30 years of certainty, because that is how real power works, not with a shout, but with a number that cannot be argued with. Ashworth called the vote because someone had to. The room that had walked in belonging to Catherine voted the only way the math allowed it to vote. When it was done, Catherine sat at the head of a table that was no longer hers, and the thing that had organized her entire life, the absolute belief that she alone stood between her family and ruin, lay in pieces in front of her. The man who had broken it was the man she had been most certain could never touch her. She did not cry. Whatever else Catherine was, she did not cry in rooms. But something in her face came apart very quietly, the way old mortar comes apart, and for the first time anyone present could remember, she had nothing to say. It should have been the moment Jalen had wanted for 4 years. He had imagined it 100 different ways. Catherine humbled. The floor pulled out. The look on her face when she understood. And now that it was here, it tasted of almost nothing. Because the only face in the room he actually cared about was not Catherine's, it was Lorraine's, and Lorraine was looking at him as if she had never seen him before. He watched her run the arithmetic, the fund, the years, the spare house that had told her nothing because it had been designed to tell her nothing. The man who had said, "Come inside and plan for me now," while holding a 48% secret behind his back. The board filed out. Philip had already gone. Sandra gathered her portfolio and made herself absent the way good attorneys can, and in the emptying room, Lorraine stood and faced him across the table. "How long?" she said. "4 years, all of it, since the week after the dinner, the house on the south side. There's nothing in it. You did that on purpose. Yes, that night I came to you." Her voice was level, which was worse than if it hadn't been. "I told you I was done being decided for. I put my hand on your face. And you already had all of this." She gestured at the table, the documents, the wreckage of her mother. "You let me think I was choosing a landscaper. You let me feel brave. And the whole time I was walking into the last act of something you had already written. There it was. The exact wound he had known the truth would open. He could have softened it. He had the kind of money that buys very good softening. Instead, he did the thing he had learned, too late and at too high a cost, was the only thing worth doing with her. He told the truth. "I came back to destroy her," Jalen said. "That's real. I'm not going to stand here and pretend the revenge wasn't real because you'd know I was lying and I'm done lying to you. I came back for her. You were the thing I never accounted for, and I told you that in the dark, and it was the truest sentence I'd said in 4 years. He came around the table slowly, so she could step back if she wanted to. She didn't. I didn't tell you about the fund because by the time I wanted to, it had stopped being a weapon and started being something that could hurt you. And I was a coward about it. I kept waiting for a better moment. There wasn't one. And this is what waiting cost me. Then why didn't you let her win this morning?" Lorraine said. "If this was about her, you had your revenge the second you walked through that door. You didn't need to save my job to destroy my mother." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He reached to where Sandra had left a single document on the table, set apart from the others, and slid it across to Lorraine. "That's a transfer of voting proxy," he said. "It assigns the full voting power of my 48.1% to you. Not the ownership. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I'm giving you the money. I earned it. And owning the debt is the only thing keeping this company out of worse hands than mine. But the votes, the control, every decision this company makes, it goes through you now, not me." He held her eyes. "I spent 4 years building the one thing powerful enough to take your mother's chair away from her. I am not going to turn around and sit in it myself. That's the difference. That's the only way I know to show you the difference." Lorraine looked at the document. The proof was not in anything he had said. Anyone can say anything. It was in the page in front of her. A man handing away freely the exact instrument of power he had spent 4 years and a hidden fortune to build. You do not surrender your only weapon to someone you are still using. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. In the house that night, you should have told me and trusted me to still choose you. I know." He looked at the proxy between them. "I didn't trust it. After 4 years of holding that secret, I didn't believe a single honest sentence could survive in the same room as all that money. That was my failure." "Not yours." Across the room, Catherine had not moved. She had heard everything. And the thing that broke in her now was not her power. That was already gone. But the thing underneath it, the lesson she had built her whole life on, that a man with nothing and a gift for making you trust him would always, in the end, take everything. Because she had just watched a man with everything, a man she had given every reason to take it all, set it down and hand it to her daughter. Otis Langford had walked into her father's house with empty pockets and walked out with a fortune. Jalen had walked into hers with a fortune in his pocket and was walking out having given it away. For 40 years, she had been certain she was protecting Lorraine from men like him. She had spent that entire time mistaking the one man who would not take for the kind who always would, and the cost of the mistake was sitting in the silence of this room. I was wrong about you, Catherine said. The words came out like something pulled up by the root. They were not graceful. She had never learned how to be graceful, but they were true, and everyone in the room could hear what they had cost her. I have been wrong about you since the night I threw you out of my house. Jalen looked at her. Yes, he said. You were. He didn't gloat. There was nothing left to gloat over. But you raised her, and whatever else you got wrong, you didn't get her wrong. She fought you. She built the case that saved this company before I ever came through that door. You taught her to be strong enough to stand against you, and that turned out to be the best thing you ever did, even though you never meant it as a gift. Lorraine signed the proxy. She set the pen down and looked at her mother. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness, not yet, but was perhaps the first cleared ground where forgiveness might, given enough time and enough truth, be built. 6 months later, the Winfield reopened. The scaffolding came down on a morning in early spring, and the old inn stood in the Savannah light looking the way its builders must have imagined it. Whole, cared for, deserving of the ground it sat on. Lorraine ran the company now, ran it well, ran it on her own decisions, her own signature, her own name. The board that had once walked into a room ready to remove her waited now to hear what she thought. She had not been carried there. She had built it herself, the same way she had built the case in the folder, and everyone who mattered knew it. Catherine kept a small office at the edge of the property. Lorraine had insisted on it, over Jalen's quiet objection and Catherine's stiff, disbelieving silence. No authority to speak of. A seat at the margin of something that had once been entirely hers. She took it because the alternative was nothing, and slowly, in the way of a person learning a language very late in life, she began to look at the man her daughter loved and see only the man. Not the empty pockets he had once carried, not the color of his skin, not the fear she had worn for 40 years and called wisdom. In the Winfield's restored garden, on the evening of the reopening, Jalen and Lorraine stood together a little apart from the lights and the guests. The jasmine was blooming the way it had the day he came back, and the city smelled the way it always had, except that now it was not lying to him. You gave me the votes, Lorraine said. You could have run all of it. Most people would have. I didn't build it to run it, Jalen said. I built it to set it down in front of you. He took her hand. There was nothing of the old distance left in it. No formality, no disguise, no secret. I spent 4 years thinking I came back to take something from your mother. Turns out I came back to give something to you. I just had to lose almost everything to figure out which one it was. They stood in the garden where, 4 years before, a woman had decided that a young man with nothing was not allowed to dream. And the dream had outlived the decision, and there was nothing left between them but the future they finally got to choose for themselves. Equals. Free. The beginning of something neither of them would ever have to ask anyone's permission to keep. And that's where Jalen and Lorraine's story comes to rest. In a garden, on equal ground, with nothing between them but the life they get to build together. But I want to hear from you. Did Jalen make the right call handing Lorraine the votes instead of keeping the power for himself? Or was there a part of you that wanted him to make Catherine answer a little longer before he let her keep that small office at the edge of things? There's no wrong answer. Stories like this live or die by how they make you feel, and I'm curious where this one landed for you. And here's the thing I really want to ask. A lot of us have known a Catherine, someone who looked at us, or at someone we loved, and decided we weren't enough. Someone who measured a person's worth by their bank account, or their last name, or the wrong things entirely, and got it completely wrong. If you've ever lived that moment, or if you've watched someone you care about prove a person like that wrong, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. Your stories are where the best of these scripts come from, and the ones you tell often end up becoming the next story I write. So if something in this one reminded you of your own life, tell me about it. I read every single one, and I'm always grateful you're here.